All right, we're going to get started now, and I thank everybody for joining. I'm Sarah Ford, Director of Projects and Programs at the Business Council of Sustainable Development Australia. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where I'm located, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to welcome all the attendees and our panellists today to our webinar on Australia's first vehicle-to-grid trial. This webinar forms part of BCSDA's Mobility and Cities Workgroup's goals, which is to share knowledge and accelerate business towards sustainable mobility solutions. Can I invite you to just ensure that you've got your name and, if you can, your organisation listed, and feel free to add that into the chat. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the BCSDA website following this event. Now I would like to actually introduce our panellists for today. Firstly, we have Todd Eagles, who's the Group Manager for Product and Strategic Deployments at Actu-AGL, and he leads the strategic direction for energy market offers, energy efficiency programs, electric vehicles, virtual power plants, and other emerging technologies. We've got Dr. Bjorn Sturenberg. He is from the Australian National University. He's the research leader in the battery storage and grid integration program. His previous experiences include a PhD researching the physics of solar cells, implementing Australia's first solar storage microgrid in an apartment, and leading some startups from inception to acquisition. Welcome, Bjorn. Ben Warren, the National Manager for Electrification and Mobility at Nissan, and he's driving Nissan's electrification strategy in Australia, as well as advocating for and supporting the role of electric vehicles and how they can play that within the broader energy ecosystem. And thank you, Ben, who's also a member of BCSDA. And Tim Washington, CEO of JetCharge, Australia's leading EV charging infrastructure business and co-founder of ChargeFox, Australia's largest EV charging network. Tim is also the chair of the Electric Vehicle Council, the industry peak representative body. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A, and we'll come to these at the end after we've heard from the panel. I'm now going to hand it over to Ben. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Sarah. I guess this is a really exciting project and really good for have the team and everybody here to talk about it today. And I guess, where does it start? To kick things off, I wanted to talk about just briefly electric vehicles and the fact that they can be more than just a mobility solution. But I guess first and foremost, electric vehicles need to be that mobility solution. And why do people choose electric vehicles? And typically the response from our customers is pretty unanimous. They're brilliant to drive, right? They're fun, they're responsive, they're quiet, they're smooth. They don't contribute to, negatively to road noise. They don't contribute to pollution in the air from not having no tailpipes. So really fun, exciting driving experience, but they're also convenient because by sheer nature, all of a sudden now we don't have to go to the petrol station. So I don't know about you, but when I see the little fuel warning light pop up on my dashboard, it doesn't really excite me about all things to do with life. I don't want to go there. I have to stand there and hold the nozzle and watch it go into the car like some sort of chaperone for fuel. It's not fun. Whereas with an electric vehicle, you can plug it in where you have a power point. So plug it in at home, walk away. I don't have to watch it. Super convenient. But also for fleets, it's the stable operating costs. It's long been documented and spoken about that EVs have a better whole of life running cost advantage. And a lot of that comes down to stability as well. And what I mean by that is, here's an example from last year, and it's probably the most poignant in my mind, that we talk about fuel prices and how far they can move. In one day, the price of fuel in my local service station up the road from my house in about 4 hours went from $1.34 to $1.72. So a huge swing. That's 38 cents a litre, or 28%, and that's about $19 worth of fuel on an average 50-litre tank, which really, when we thought about it, was how much power can I buy for $19? And really, on an average tariff, it's about 425 kilometres worth of driving in an electric vehicle, 800 Ks if I charge off peak. And if I'm charging using my solar panels, it's for the low price of complimentary, and I can drive forever. So I guess it's the having not only the whole of life operating cost benefit, but really having that surety around those operation costs, because power doesn't fluctuate in the same manner that that fuel does on an hourly or minute by minute basis in a lot of cases to the retail market. Now, what also is really exciting is obviously electric vehicles are a great mobility solution, but have the opportunity to go further than that, which is what this whole REVS project is about, and the notion of vehicle to grid. So conceptually, what is vehicle to grid? Well, like all electric vehicles, we have to charge the car. But the Nissan Leaf also allows you to take that power out of the vehicle and use it to power the home or the building. You can pair it with your solar panels on the roof of the house. You can store that solar during the day and then use that power later on at night. So effectively, we've got not only a great car to drive, but also the world's sexiest home battery. Now, in this instance, this is where we're deploying this into a fleet scale, which is again really, really exciting, because we can start to talk about taking that beyond just the house or the building and into supporting the grid. And we'll talk about that a bit later. But this is not new technology. This has been rolled out around the world. There's numerous projects in Japan, in Europe, around vehicle to home, vehicle to grid, vehicle to building trials. But what's really exciting is this project is the first time that we will bring it to Australia and deploy this technology to the specific needs of the Australian grid and the Australian consumer, which again is a really, really exciting thing to be there. So with that, I'll hand over to Todd from ActuAGL to talk about how this project has come together.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone for their time. I guess it's probably worth looking at how the project came together was from this perfect nexus that was occurring inside the ACT with technology, sustainability, and policy. ActuAGL, we were looking at. Sorry, I'll start with the technology piece. And the sustainability piece. The ACT has a 100% renewable electricity generation, which basically makes EV fuel emissions free. That was sort of the first consideration in developing this project. The second was the technology supportive. So ActuAGL, we were already investigating how batteries were able to support grid frequency, and there's a natural transition then to think about, rather than just a home battery, but a huge battery on wheels, which is an electric vehicle. And the third is the policy piece, which is where the ACT government has adopted this policy to move from fossil-fueled vehicles through to zero-emission vehicles in their fleets. So while this nexus was occurring, our friends at the ANU further developed and created some sophistication around the idea, and conceived the realising electric vehicle to grid services, and the acronym for that being REVS, nice car terminology for the project. And we officially formed the consortium in 2019, and have subsequently been developing the project since then. So why run a vehicle to grid pilot program? So Ben touched on the fact that conceptually vehicle to grid is pretty simple. You use your car as a battery to support the grid during periods where there's high electricity demand, or there are constraints due to events like lightning or trees falling over on power lines. However, at the moment, there's no standards for managing the connection to the energy grid, or established business models on how these vehicles should and can integrate into the energy system. So to date, the vehicle to grid capabilities have only been really demonstrated in really controlled environments like defence bases, microgrids and labs. And from those trials, there was no shared value around the development of the business case, no insight into how customers were going to respond to the new technology or the price signals. There was no network or security impacts and no data sharing. But all of those things are now happening in the ACT, so or through this project in Canberra. So there are many stakeholders and moving pieces in introducing any type of new technology. And trials are a really important part of the process, which allow us to understand the operational limits, collect data, and build the right regulatory frameworks and business models. And typically these projects touch on three areas, and just on that previous slide, it's the technical, the economic, and the social. And I'll just touch on the social part, just conscious of time. And that the social part's really about what are customers' expectations, how much control are people willing to hand over, and what type of remuneration is going to be required for them to allow their vehicles to be used to support the grid. What are those natural behaviours of customers, and what behaviours can be influenced, as in when the car is where and when the car is going to be parked, and whether it's going to be plugged in when it's parked. So the concept of vehicle to grid is quite simple in itself, but the execution and development of a new market is not. So these trials are really important tools to help shape and inform both the regulatory market, but also business model development. Who do we need involved? This is jump to the next slide. There are so many stakeholders in this process of standing up a trial and making it operational, and each stakeholder is absolutely critical to the broader success of the project. And without any one of these stakeholders, the projects quite simply can't happen. So everybody is equally invested into the success of the project. And included in this project, we've got network operators who own the poles and wires with Evo Energy. We've got vehicle OEMs and a world leader in electric vehicles with Nissan. Charging providers, and again, another world leader with JetCharge. SG Fleet looking after the vehicle management. Most importantly, we've got a customer. So the ACT government is the customer within this project. It's ACT government people who are driving and parking and plugging in these vehicles. There needs to be an energy retailer to manage the flow of energy into the market. So from the vehicle and into the distributor, but also to manage the financial transaction between the market, the retailer, and the customer. But outside of just the operational component, and I missed out on our very dear friends Bjorn, at the ANU, who are undertaking the research, which is modelling what the future grid really needs to look like. Outside of those operational components and the key stakeholders who are participating in this trial, we've got to make sure that we continue to be engaged, and that we've got a view towards improving the policy framework and supporting the new market at the conclusion of the trial. So it means that we've got to keep close to other stakeholders, and we do that through a knowledge sharing framework, and that includes governments, which are government organisations like ARENA and the Australian Energy Regulator, industry organisations like the Electric Vehicle Council. It's important for this information to propagate itself through the industry so people understand what new opportunities in business models might look like. And again, importantly, the organisations like the Energy Consumers Organisation. Next slide, please. So this sort of just gives a bit of a pictorial around the flow, what actually happens. So I won't start with ActuAGL. I'll start with the vehicle Nissan. It's important that we've got a vehicle that actually has some operating parameters and can undertake vehicle to grid energy transfer. So it can both ingest and discharge energy into the grid. And Nissan can also monitor the vehicle performance of what's actually happening to the battery when it comes to degradation and the like. JetCharge is the charging provider and looks after the supply and installation of vehicle to grid chargers, and also the design of some of the frequency control systems and the integration into the ActuAGL bidding platform. So again, that interface between the retail proposition and the market and the transfer of funds. Evo Energy, who's the local energy network operator, and they manage the connection of requests and make sure that the vehicles and the operating system that sits around the project is assessed against what the potential grid impacts or opportunities might be. And then ANU underpins all of this, making sure that we're able to test these FCAS, or the frequency control systems, in a laboratory environment before and during and while we roll this out into the market. But they're also leading the knowledge sharing research and supporting the project management in how we roll the project out. It is important to recognise that this didn't happen in isolation, and that the project did receive funding from the Australian Renewable Energy Agency as part of their Advancing Renewables program.
All right, I'll jump in here if that's allowed, Todd. So in my part of the presentation, I'm just going to spend a few minutes outlining the range of benefits that vehicle-to-grid services offer to individuals, the owners of vehicles, and to the electricity system, and then focus on the specific service that we're delivering in the REVS demonstration. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the key for vehicle-to-grid, like any other service, is that it really needs to demonstrate value to the end customers, which in the case of vehicle-to-grid are the owners of the electric vehicles. And so the owners of the electric vehicles can benefit both through financial means, but also importantly through non-financial means. Starting with the financial, we've already heard how vehicle-to-grid can reduce customers' electricity bills by shifting the load, shifting their load either in regards to electricity prices or demand charges, or also by absorbing and storing locally produced solar power. This is often referred to as vehicle to building or vehicle to home. And then the other way in which owners can benefit is through what is referred to as vehicle to grid, which is where the vehicle is providing services to the wider electricity system, either to the electricity retailers or the electricity network companies, or to the power system operator. In addition to this, it's really important, sorry if we can leave it on that last slide, to also consider the non-financial benefits the customers receive. These include a feeling of greater self-sufficiency and independence in how they manage and provide their own electricity supply. The security of having the energy stored in the vehicle to be able to provide backup power in cases of blackouts. And also the satisfaction of contributing to the decarbonisation of the electricity system, either by using more renewables from their own property or by contributing to supporting the increased penetration of renewables into the grid by providing these grid services. Next slide, thanks. For the electricity system, vehicle to grid really transforms electric vehicles from potentially quite a troublesome and very large load on the system to a tremendous source of fast and very flexible energy storage, which is really invaluable for operating a power system. To give a sense of the kind of importance of the scale of the integrating electric vehicles into the power system, if in the worst case scenario, if all of Australia's vehicles charged at the same time, they could add over a third to the peak power placed on the grid, which the grid simply would not be able to handle. Or if only 1 in 5 of Australia's vehicles were to be enabled with vehicle to grid, they would represent more energy storage than 2,000 of the Tesla big batteries, which is up until last week was the world's largest battery. Or equivalently, they'd have more energy storage than the planned Snow 2.0 pumped hydro works down in the Snowy Mountains. So that kind of gives you a feel of the scale of the opportunity both for customers or the owners of vehicles and for the electricity system. So now if we move on to what we're doing in the REVS program. So in REVS, because it's a pilot kind of demonstration, we're being very selective in just demonstrating one targeted service. And because of the configuration of the consortium and because we want to be very conservative in how much we utilize the batteries in the vehicles, the service that we're going to demonstrate is for the vehicles to inject power into the grid on only very rare occasions when the grid is really, really stretched and really needs that power. So let's go through how that works. So the really important thing to understand for the electricity system point of view is that the generation of electricity must always match the load or the consumption of electricity, shown here kind of schematically. The great thing is that matching or mismatch is captured in one physical quantity of the power system, which is the frequency of the AC waveform. And so if there's too much load, not enough power being generated, then the frequency will drop, and we can measure that. And likewise, if there's too much generation, then the frequency rises, and we can also measure that. Both of those are not good situations. In both cases, you're heading towards a blackout. So how do our vehicles contribute towards providing this energy security? So what the vehicles are doing, shown here pictorially, is that they're going to monitor the frequency of the grid. And if the frequency, let's say it drops, let's say that one of Todd's lightning bolts takes out a transmission line to a coal-fired generator, and that power is lost to the system, then the frequency will drop. Our EVs will measure that, and then they will start injecting, within a fraction of a second, will be injecting power from their batteries into the grid, and thereby help rebalance supply and demand in the grid and prevent a blackout from occurring. Next slide, please. So this is, like I say, a very targeted service that we're providing, and we're providing it in a very kind of specific context as well, of working with a government fleet primarily in the ACT. But as part of the role of the ANU, we're also doing research on the much broader, going from that single case to learning much more broadly around the full value proposition for owners of vehicles and for all other stakeholders, which, similarly to Todd, kind of spans the technical, if we can get that up, please, which, let's just get them all, the technical, the economic, as well as the social components, and seeing how we can go from this demonstration of the first vehicles in Australia to deliver vehicle-to-grid services to a roadmap for how these can be delivered at scale, which importantly includes a lot of working with industry and with governments on establishing what the rules and regulations and incentives are that can accelerate this, and also what are the types of business models and the types of customer value propositions that address kind of the needs of, like I said, the customers, the wider electricity system, and maintaining the power system and the vehicles within their technical bounds. That's my contribution. Thanks.
Thanks, Bjorn. We'll move to Tim. Welcome, Tim, if you'd like to take us through.
Hello. Yes, no problem. So let's go to the next slide. So you're going to see, like, you've already seen variations of this graphic, of which this is the crappiest, but it basically does give you an overview of all the players that are involved. Really, I don't want to talk about all the players because I think Todd's already done that, but I think the impression that a lot of you will have through this presentation is that, God, it's a lot of work to do vehicle to grid, because you need all of these players, and you need the vehicles to be there, you need the chargers to be there, you need the grid operator to be there. But the reality is that the transition to where this is going to be is much easier. Whoever's moving the slides is doing an amazing job, thank you. And so the transition is much easier because it only starts with a vehicle and with a charging station. And I think I just want to pause there for 1 second and kind of give you the wider context of what's happening with the vehicles and what's happening with the charging stations. Right now, vehicles equipped with bidirectional charging are rare. There's only a couple of manufacturers in the world who are offering this commercially. Nissan is the forerunner in that. And that's why it's really important for Nissan to be on board for this trial. But over the next 5 years, every electric vehicle will be capable of bidirectional charging out of the box. And so what that essentially means is that when you walk into a dealership and you want to buy a car, by about 2025 to 2027, we're going to see price parity between an internal combustion engine vehicle and an electric vehicle. So when you go into that dealership or you buy it online, whatever, and you purchase that electric vehicle, it will not only be the car you purchase because you need it as a mobility solution, but it will also be the largest piece of battery storage that you will own, even if you have bought home storage. And as Bjorn talked about before, the implications for that are massive because you haven't gone into the dealership to specifically buy it as energy storage, but the energy storage will be available to you essentially from the car just because you bought that car. When you take that vehicle home and you want to charge it, the charging station that you get may not be capable of doing bi-directional charging. But as the costs come down in price for the charging hardware as well, what people will start noticing is that they can actually pick up a very affordable, very cheap bi-directional charger. And as soon as you plug that bi-directional charger in, this asset that you have bought for mobility purposes all of a sudden becomes one of the cheapest form of storing electricity and one of the cheapest forms of distributing electricity. And so you don't need to worry about all the other players as part of this kind of trial. You don't need to contact Todd at ActuAGL and say, hey, Todd, can I please aggregate my vehicle into your bid engine? Because all of that work will have already been done for you by various players in the market, and you will start getting offers from people like retailers to say, hey, can I give you this vehicle to grid charging station? Can we use your vehicle as an energy asset? And over time, the way people think about mobility will change because the core asset that forms basically that mobility landscape, being the car, will primarily be used as an energy asset rather than as a mobility asset, rather than as a car. So when you have it there and it's sitting in your house or your apartment and it's being used 90% of the time as a battery, we're going to start changing the way we think about cars. And that for me is very exciting. And it really just starts with this image. It is essentially a car parked in a garage with a charger, and it looks incredibly innocuous and it looks incredibly easy. And the aim of this trial is to bring all the people together that is going to be required to make it easy for people. And as soon as you make it easy, as soon as you make it accessible, it basically means that people like us who are saying we're going to have 3 times as much storage as Snowy Hydro will no longer seem like lunatics because people will just have this enabled in their homes. And I think that is the story that we want to paint, that this trial, yes, it is complicated, but it is complicated so that the future is easy. And the easier we make it, the more people will take it up, and the cheaper our electricity will become.
Thanks, Tim. Dual purposing vehicles and the value that it can add both to electricity prices and the broader electricity system. Tim really does make it sound like a very simple proposition, and it's a future where we can imagine it's just quite simply plugging our car in and everything else is automated. Is exactly the aspirational is aspirationally where we want to get to. So to get us there, part of this is making sure that we can move through this project and undertake it with some level, a reasonable level of ambition. So the project does go over a 2-year period, and at the end of that 2 years, we'll have 50 odd vehicles coupled with vehicle to grid capable chargers, and we'll demonstrate that vehicle to grid capabilities using commercially available vehicles and commercially available chargers can operate in a real live grid and market. So the first part of that timeline is making sure that we've got all 51 of those vehicles plugged in and operational in the ACT. The next part is making sure that we're demonstrating all of the complexity in real life markets and making sure that all of the testing and validation has occurred prior to deployment. And some of that technical testing occurs over in the shiny new ANU DR lab, or demand response lab, which again, with a view to making this whole process a whole lot simpler when it becomes a truly commercial proposition. The next part is after that lab testing is around some of the economic modelling and making sure that when we're undertaking grid services or frequency support for the grid, we're doing it in a manner that is ensuring that there is low wear on the system, both the vehicle and the other types of energy assets that might be connected to it, but also that that we've got the data to make sure that the rest of the potential value stack is going to be available. So that undertaking that type of sophisticated underpinning crucial technical service is important to make sure that we can simplify the proposition at the end. And then most importantly, because we're all very good people, we just share our findings, making sure that as we learn new things, there's a number of knowledge sharing articles and presentations like this that are shared with both industry, regulators, and governments, so that we're able to get to that future place a lot quicker. Next slide, please. To date, this is the fun part where we get to do some gloating. We've got 19 vehicles out of the 51 already on the roads, and the vehicles supplied, the vehicle to grid, or the large batteries on wheels, kindly developed by our friends at Nissan. And then next slide, please. And so the project launched officially in 2020, in June this year. It'll conclude in January 2022, and it's split into six milestones. And while I won't touch on each of those, while we are only a few months into the project, there's already been quite a lot of activity with the acquisition of those first 19 vehicles and the first fleet of the vehicles, the development of the compatible control systems, and planning for the ongoing deployment of the bidirectional charging stations. And all of that should be finished by the end of this year. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Todd.
Common hazard of Zoom calls, you're on mute. So I guess to conclude, really with a couple of closing thoughts. So again, electric vehicles, they're a fantastic mobility solution. They need to fit the needs of the business, and first and foremost, a vehicle needs to do the job a vehicle needs to do. But with electric vehicles, they also unlock a host of other opportunities, which is what this trial is about. And ultimately, for a consumer or for a fleet, effectively, you're maximising the asset utilisation for both mobility and energy purposes. So one of the common slights on vehicles is people buy them to park them because they sit in a driveway or a car park for 90% of the time. This is a way of actually unlocking the utilisation of those assets and contributing back to not only your own business or personal energy independence and helping reduce costs, but also contributing to the wider ecosystem and leveraging some benefit for that as well. So I guess in closing, how to find out more. So there will be a project website coming soon, so keep an eye out for that, and that will be able to track the progress. But also, if you've got any questions around making the fleet transition or making the transition to EVs on the vehicle side, obviously myself, feel free to reach out on the charging solution side and how that can work. Tim is the best port of call there as well. So again, those conversations, those questions, happy to take them, happy to talk through them and understand what the opportunities could look like for all of you. So I guess with that, I'll hand back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Ben, Todd, Bjorn, Tim. Amazing. And I have to say, keeping to time, if you guys keep to time like this in your timeline as you've done in the webinar, it's going to be rocking and rolling really smoothly. So very, very impressed. We have a few questions coming in on the Q&A, and if any of the other attendees have questions, just pop them in. I do note there are quite a few abbreviations which will be unfamiliar to some of us, so I'm going to try and hand that over, but please, if you can, spell things out just to make it easier for everyone who's not completely across all the ins and outs. So a question, am I correct in assuming this trial will focus on FCAS, which is frequency control ancillary services? We might need a little bit of an explanation around what that means, rather than RET, R-E-R-T participation. Perhaps someone can just break that down in simple language for us and provide an answer. Don't forget you're on mute, Todd and Ben.
I'm happy to go.
Sure.
All right. Yes, very well spotted. You're correct. The service that we're providing is just not even all of FCAS, frequency control ancillary services. So to explain actually what those are just the market mechanism by which the adjustment of generation and load to keep the system in balance is remunerated. So you get paid, these vehicles will get paid to inject power to when the grid needs it, or to charge when the grid actually needs a little bit of extra load put onto the system. And we're not contributing, that market itself gets broken into roughly two parts. One where you're balancing the supply demand all of the time, every couple of seconds. And in the other set of services where you're on call and you only inject power when called upon in the case of kind of an event that causes the frequency to deviate quite significantly. We're only participating in those contingency services, which has the beautiful effect that our vehicles are paid whenever they're plugged in, whenever they're plugged in, they're on call. And then they only have to inject power kind of a couple of dozen times, say, per year, when a storm comes through and creates quite a significant mismatch in supply and demand.
So whether this is for you, Bjorn, or someone else, in saying that in the future there are many more vehicles available to provide energy back to the grid, is this looking potentially to be like a sign-up deal that you say my vehicle is available to draw that back? Or perhaps that's a question for Tim to explain how that breaks down, that you have something in your charger that knows when to pull it back or when not to, because you might be needing the energy yourself into the grid.
Yeah, so I don't want to overcomplicate this, but I think there are two aspects to this. The first is very self-sufficient. So essentially, if you have solar panels in your home, you can store that electricity in your vehicle and then return it back into your house at night. So that's a very simple use case. Another more exciting use case is that you can drive to work and charge at work and then take that electricity home and power your house with it, and hopefully not pay for the electricity at work. You might go to Woolworths or Coles, charge up there and go home and power your house with it. So none of those things require you to participate in any kind of scheme. And I think one thing we didn't really mention was the whole role of bidirectional charging with the uptake of renewables, in that, we obviously have a lot of solar during the middle of the day. What this allows us to do is to increase the grid penetration of renewables by basically having the capacity there to suck all the renewables up and then shift that discharge back into the grid or back into your home for nighttime. So everyone will be able to do that regardless of whether you're part of a scheme. And then on top of that, there will be companies, retailers, aggregators, everybody in kind of who are looking at this space. They'll come out and say, on top of all the things that you normally do, if you allow us to kind of control your charging station and time when you charge and discharge, we'll pay you an additional amount. And so those are the two layers. But the most basic layer means that people can have full autonomy and control over how they consume electricity, not only for their vehicle, but also for their home, which I think is the most exciting part.
Fantastic. So I suppose a lot of people on the call, and obviously we're the Business Council for Sustainable Development, we have a lot of members who are businesses, and we've been speaking a lot around the role of fleets, and interested that this potentially offers an additional benefit for your fleet if you're looking at accelerating to that transition to electric vehicles of, I don't know if you say it's money making, but there's all these additional benefits for a fleet. Is there any specific information that you wanted to impart around businesses and fleets thinking about this process? I understand that at the moment it seems that Nissan has the only bi-directional cars available, and that then may not always be fit for purpose. We have a question here of when Nissan are you going to get a four-wheel drive dual cab ute? But is there some comment you'd like to make on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we help fleets every day, obviously, electrify. And the first step is you don't need to do anything special to enable bidirectional charging. That's the first thing. So if you're setting up your vehicle fleet for electric, that's a good first step. But set your company up for electrification. That's the first thing. The second thing is that once the bidirectional kind of vehicles do come onto the market, you will need to replace some hardware, or you could just like supplement that hardware with additional hardware. So that's not a big deal. And there are lots of providers who can help you. Sorry, when I say lots of providers, there are providers who can help you. And then the last bit is that I think there is an increasing amount of optimism around what the role of fleet managers and companies can have, both in terms of saving costs, because we imagine a world where fuel will essentially be free for fleet managers. We think there's enough services in the market that the vehicles can provide that will allow fleet managers who have a 100% electric fleet to claim zero net fuel costs. That is something that we believe in. And the second thing is that they can contribute significantly to decarbonising their company through the use of vehicles. Not only because they have no tailpipe emissions, but they can also be charged, you can guarantee them being charged via things like power purchase agreements and stuff. So it really empowers fleet managers who have more of an operational role at the moment to play a more strategic role in decarbonising their company.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tim. That's a great answer. I just have a question here. Full value stack is silent on environmental with earlier reference to reducing carbon emissions. What is the reduction of the carbon footprint with assumed scenarios using the scenario of 1 out of 5 vehicles switching? Do you know what the impact would be? Is that a question for you, Bjorn?
I'm happy to take it. Yeah, it's interesting. We kind of feel like there's obviously a lot of environmental benefits from switching from internal combustion engine vehicles over to electric vehicles. But it's quite, I think, important to see that we don't pigeonhole electric vehicles in maybe quite the same way as renewables have been cast. So I think, like Ben has outlined at the beginning, and Tim in his responses more recently, there's a lot more to an electric vehicle than just its carbon reductions. And in the case of how they affect the emissions from the vehicle itself, vehicle to grid is an add-on to that. You already have an electric vehicle when you're considering vehicle to grid. And then it's about the vehicle to grid services supporting the ever-increasing uptake of renewables, either on rooftops or connected to the grid. And the important thing is that the vehicles have large batteries and are very fast and flexible in how they can support that transition. So and then that's probably where I'd like to leave that response.
Great, thank you. Look, I have another question here, which is quite technical. Feels. Will the fleet of EVs register as a VPP as part of AMIO's VPP trial? And does the 1 megawatt minimum for bidding into FACUS apply to the fleet of EVs?
All right, I'll take this one.
And you might need to explain.
Yeah, I'll do a little bit of background on this one. So AEMO is the Australian energy market operator, and their role is to make sure that we have a secure, reliable and well-operating electricity grid across the whole of Australia. And with the adoption of more distributed energy resources, so they're things that can be controlled or that generate energy or push energy or consume energy in the grid that can be controlled. There's a lot of question around how that's changing the grid today and what the future grid might look like. So AEMO has developed a VPP trial, and VPP stands for Virtual Power Plant. And what they're looking to achieve is, as there are people who have control over sets of assets that sit out on the electricity network, what does control look like, and what does that mean for the security of the energy supply as it moves, or the energy supply, and the resilience of the market, if you like, the national electricity market. Now, there are certain rules around being able to undertake frequency control into the network. And one of the rules as it stands today is that you need to have at least 1 megawatt of bidding. Basically, you need to have some scale for it to make a difference. and AMO have introduced this virtual power plant trial, and there's some concessions available for different types of loads, be they stationary batteries or electric vehicles. But through this particular trial, we're working through our arrangements with AMO on how best to develop the learnings around using EV loads and how secure the bids might be, or how secure the supply might be of frequency services. And we're just working through some of the technicalities of that with them. But our friends at AMO are certainly part of the knowledge sharing group, and one of the more significant stakeholders, obviously, in the outcome of this project, where you're pushing energy in and out of a network.
Fantastic, thanks Todd. That is technical of us. Look, I have a really interesting question here. Do you have any plans, or are there any plans in Australia to progress bus to grid? I believe London's looking at a trial. Or do you have feelings on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in again. Definitely. So buses offer even bigger batteries than cars, as you can imagine. And there are some there's been a number of trials of electric buses in Australia. And particularly state governments and territory governments are really moving forward with electrifying their bus fleets. Sydney obviously has this year, I think, announced that they're going to transition all of their buses. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely something that is being looked at. And again, the ACT government is really proactive. They have a new electric bus strategy that's coming out quite soon. And they're very much considering electric BEG in that.
From a technical perspective, buses playing the electricity space is a lot more exciting because there's a lot more that can go wrong by doing vehicle to grid. And so right. From a company like ours that focuses on the technical hard things, it's really exciting because it essentially, you have to take into account because they're time critical assets. Mm. So when they need to leave, they need to leave. And if they don't leave, people stand there and they complain. And so, you can provide these grid services, and when these grid services are called upon, you have to make sure you can deliver, but you have to make sure that the delivery of those services don't actually impact on the dispatch schedules of those buses. And that's one of the really great things about frequency control ancillary services, is that the events don't last for very long. Mm. So you can provide immense amount of grid support through buses, which have much larger charging power, but not affect the dispatch schedule too much. But there's not a lot of I would say homogeneity among how these buses charge. It's still kind of like horses for courses at the moment. Yeah. It's not like vehicles. So it's definitely something we're all looking at. And yeah, US and kind of UK are leading the charge on that, but yeah, we won't be far behind.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, Ben, this might be a question for you. Has there been any consideration or analysis on whether there's an impact on the life of the battery if they're involved in this sort of bidirectional charging?
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the really critical, or it's one of the first comments or concerns that gets raised, and it's also one of the important factors as to why Nissan globally for these types of trials want to be proactively involved, because as part of all of this, one of the hardest things that a battery in a vehicle will ever be experienced to or subject to is driving the car. So first and foremost, you put your foot on the accelerator all the way to the floor. That's the hardest job that battery will ever have to do. You put it into contrast of powering the home. A home load is nowhere near as intense, and it's quite stable. So it's a very comfortable, happy environment for a battery to be in. So as part of all of these trials, we do some due diligence up front, specifically when we're talking about grid services around modelling charging and discharging performance, to understand what's the driving habits of a fleet and what's the usage patterns of those cars, and therefore what's the charging requirement just in normal operation, and what do we have left to play with when it comes to providing services to the grid. And we go through that process with technical centres in Japan to make sure that we don't see any problems. And then as we follow the trials through, we keep monitoring the vehicles as well, because every trial has its own nuances and different learning experiences. But off the bat, as a brand, we wouldn't be spruiking vehicle to grid and the benefits that can come with it if we thought it had a detrimental impact to the longevity or the life of the product. So we're pretty confident. Vehicle to grid and vehicle to home and all this bidirectional charging ability, it just comes down to how it is managed. And one of the requirements that we have is that any hardware used for these types of programs have been Nissan tested and certified to make sure that there won't be any adverse impacts on a customer. So it's a critical part of the process, and having all those standards and regulations in place is all about protecting the consumer and their very beautiful Nissan Leaf in their driveway.
Can I ask, so obviously this trial is being carried out with the ACT government, who are very forward thinking in what they're doing around EVs and the renewable space. What is the feeling for other states and territories? We've mentioned New South Wales. Do we have any comment on Victoria, South Australia, WA? Does anyone know?
Well, I guess from our perspective, every state is making their own, going through their own processes and going through their own due diligence and understanding. We've seen, obviously, ACT government has for some time been very proactive in the space of electric vehicles, but in terms of emissions and energy, source of energy. And we've also seen some quite strong initiatives start to be announced from New South Wales government quite recently. That'll come into effect soon. So there's a groundswell of positive sentiment. There's lots of activities. Everyone's kind of moving at a slightly different pace. And even if we look at the most recent publication from the Electric Vehicle Council, they gave a scorecard of each respective government layer and how well or not so well they've been doing. But behind all of that, particularly at the state level, there is quite a bit of activity and appetite, and some of the other state governments are involved in the knowledge sharing component for trials like this, because they want to be able to take the learnings and implement them for their own jurisdictions as well.
Thank you, Ben. So if I was a business and I was looking at, this sounds exciting, I can see some, a number of benefits from a business perspective. The point in which I want to move on this, I think I was hearing, is around, you have to have EVs, you have to be thinking about accelerating and transitioning your fleet now to EVs, and you're not at a disadvantage in waiting for, other models of cars to come on that are bidirectional, because there is the opportunity to add on different infrastructure at a further point in time. What's the call to action to businesses who are on the line now, outside of sort of what I'm suggesting?
If maybe I might start, and then there might be an avalanche of others jumping in after this. But I think that first point that you've made is really critical. So as a business, making the decision that you are transitioning your fleet to electrified product is the most important kind of milestone to get past. So making that decision for whatever reason, environmental, sustainability, philosophical position, whatever that may be, making the call as a business that we're going to transition it, and having that call at senior levels is the first part. When you learn to swim, you inevitably have to get in the water. So if you stand on the side of the pool and try and figure out, like, am I doing, okay, so maybe if I do that, maybe these ones, I'm not quite sure, you'll never get in the water, because there's too many things to think about. Once you're in the pool, you've made the decision to get in the pool, then it becomes a hell of a lot easier. And that's ultimately the same thing with EVs. So we've made the call that we're doing it. We're now going through the minutiae and some of the details, because if you try and answer every question first, you will never get in the water. And that's first and foremost. And there's plenty of people in the industry, vehicle side, charging side, the FMOs, so SG Fleet, who are involved in this program, have a pretty comprehensive eStart program that helps fleets with understanding their usage and which vehicles are fit for purpose and all those things. So there's lots of different places and people who can help with that knowledge. But once you've decided to get in the water, then each decision from that point onwards is so much easier.
Thanks, Ben. Don't know if anyone else wanted to add to that, but that's a good point to say there are other players as part of this consortium, including SG fleets. And also just to say, there is, this is a plug, Charge Together Fleets, which BCSDA was involved in and funded by ARENA, which is another fantastic resource to look at if you're still early on and exploring the business case for EVs and wanting further information. So there is plenty, it would seem, information out there to help people to get going. Todd, did you have something you'd like to contribute?
Probably just a proof point. When we start to see large corporates in Australia start to make announcements like AGL just did today about moving 400 of their vehicles to electric vehicles, I think that's really the start of what a groundswell is going to be as people look for the opportunity, not just from projects like this when it comes to bidirectional and frequency control, but when it comes to the opportunity in its entirety when it comes to fleet electrification. I think it's a pretty clear signal to the market that this isn't while this is a trial or this is a particular project, the EV as a movement is not necessarily is directional. So it is only going to grow and grow and grow. So ultimately, there is some inevitability that fleets are going to transition to electric vehicles over time. It's just probably more a case, as Ben mentioned, of when are you going to start doing it?
Fantastic. Thanks, Todd. Well, we're running amazingly on time. I just have to say again that this team is fantastic keeping to timelines. We don't actually have any other questions in the Q&A at the moment. So I'd like to thank the panel for joining us today and for your time. And we know it's early days in the trial, so that's really exciting. And I definitely feel the enthusiasm of all our panelists today. For all of the attendees, thank you for coming and joining us. If you do have any further questions, you feel free to contact me and I'm happy to connect you with our panelists or to other sources of information. And obviously the panelists have provided their details. We look forward to having you back again and hearing, maybe in another 6 months where the project's at and to be feeding back any information to attendees on the work that you're doing. So I'll close the webinar with 2 minutes to spare and thanks everyone for joining us.